I know that it was yesterday when we offered up some personal reflections, but I can't resist the opportunity to offer a couple more. I first encountered Mark in a direct way in 1993 when I was a graduate student. I was very proud of a paper that I'd written for a seminar, and I was encouraged by my dad to send it to a journal whose editor he respected and trusted. And so I did, and that was mine. And I received, soon thereafter, a very lengthy set of comments, a lengthy commentary directly from the editor-in-chief of mine. Now I'm a first-year grad student, and here it comes. Mark Sainsbury's got a page of comments for me on my crappy term paper. And that was very inspiring and encouraging. And so I'm very grateful for his seriousness of purpose. This was mentioned yesterday, his work as editor of mine, and the effect that's had on the discipline, and in particular on me as in that small part. Then encountered him again when he joined us in Texas in 2002, and where, as I said yesterday, he's been instrumental in very much the way many of you were talking about how he was so important in setting the tone and the ethos here in London. Similarly, in Austin, he's been instrumental in that way. You're a very important figure in establishing the way we roll. I should say that one should neglect to mention Victoria Goodman's role in that context, because it isn't only the awesome philosophical interventions and the wise and sage administrative news shared with those of us at the front line of that, but it is also, I think Hans mentioned, the dinner parties, the bread, the coffee, the wine, the company, the photographs. All of that comes together into a way of life that I feel fortunate to have been close to. So thank you for all of that, Tori and Mark. But enough of that. Back to the philosophy. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Mark on a topic that he's been working on for a few years. And the topic today, the title today is Vagueness is Boundarylessness. So, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, David. And there are many other people I'd like to thank too. So first of all, the organizers of this lecture, Anthony Saville and Alex Grzynkowski, and I know other people as well have played a significant role in bringing this about, like Rosa and Maria and Barry, I think, too. Anyway, I do thank you all. And I also would like to thank who actually initiated the series of Mark Sainsbury lectures, which was an extraordinarily gratifying achievement for me. Well, not an achievement, because I didn't do anything to achieve it, but anyway, it was a very gratifying happening. And it's been great coming back to London every year to be with colleagues at King's and friends in London. It really does mean a lot. So it was MM's idea, I think, but then it was, of course, supported by the department as a whole, and including the series of heads of department, David and, David, Bill, Rosa, Maria. So I thank you all for that contribution. It's made a big difference to my life. When I gave my inaugural lecture at King's in 1990, the topic was Concepts Without Boundaries. And after the lecture, a senior colleague, a senior philosopher whom I respected, said to me, I think the idea of boundarylessness is quite interesting, but don't imagine that the interest of the idea depends on using it to find a solution to the paradoxes of vagueness. And I think he meant that in an encouraging way. Okay, you can't solve the paradoxes of vagueness, but there's something else you can do which would be of interest. But I didn't find that very encouraging, I have to say, because it seemed to me that any decent account of vagueness must give an account of the paradoxes of vagueness. And so that's what I want to do today. If I'd known what Dorothy was going to say last night, I think I'd have suggested a collaborative enterprise because, well, first of all, we start in exactly the same place, except that I've got a nice picture and Dorothy only had a description. But also, strangely enough, we end up in what is structurally the same place. We get there by a different route, and although the places are structurally identical, they're not actually quite identical in content. So for anyone who heard Dorothy's lecture, I think would be an interesting contrast. You know, would you rather go, if you were interested in reaching this place, would you rather go to it via Dorothy's route, or would you rather go via mine? So the first thing I want to do is to say a bit more about what boundarylessness amounts to, and then I'm going to turn to the paradoxes. So boundaryless concepts contrast with classical concepts. Classical concepts meet the following condition, or they're supposed to do so, that given their meaning and the way the world is, their reference or their contribution to truth conditions is determined. So meaning plus the world determines reference or truth conditions. Boundaryless concepts are not like that. They do a bit of that sort of work, but they also produce cases which are borderline cases in which the meaning of the concept together with the way the world is does not determine whether the concept is or is not true of the object. The central notion for a classical concept is that of an extension, a set of things of which it's true. But the central notion for boundaryless concepts is that of a paradigm. And a boundaryless concept applies to something, provided that thing is sufficiently close to a paradigm case. This is a different notion from the notion of extension. Of course, sufficiently close is vague, but here in agreement with an answer that Dorothy gave last night to a question, the plan is not to try to eliminate vagueness, but rather to describe it in a theoretically satisfactory way, and in particular for today's talk, a way which enables us to make an appropriate response to the paradoxes. So, of course, sufficiently close to a paradigm is vague, but what do you expect? What else could it be? And what I want to suggest is that borderline cases call for free decision, not for discovery. If you're looking at a borderline case, it's no good looking harder and harder trying to get to the bottom of it, because there isn't a bottom to get to. It's up to you to decide. Now, in many cases, you will have no reason to make a decision, and in many cases there will be no point. But in other cases, you will have a reason to make a decision one way rather than another, and there will be a point. And I'll be giving some examples of that kind shortly. So the way I'd like to sum this aspect up is that boundaryless concepts may create a practical problem rather than a doxastic problem. The problem they create, the problem that borderline cases create within the boundaryless notion is not what should I believe, which would be the doxastic question, but what should I do, the practical question. What, if anything, should I do? So that is a choice, and it's a free choice. It's an exercise of freedom. One example of the choice that many of us are very familiar with just at this time of year is where to draw the numerical boundary for the lowest A. So, well, you know, there's a student with 95, there's a student with 94, there's a student with 93. There's no real difference, I mean, no really substantive difference in the intellectual merits of these students, but you do have to draw the line somewhere. Otherwise, I don't know what, you get fired. You can't submit your grades to the registrar. So this is a place where you have to make a decision. So this is a case where the decision won't be entirely arbitrary. Or one hopes it's not entirely arbitrary. On the other hand, if you draw the if you make 95 the lowest A, and the student comes to you with 94, you have to admit that there's no real difference no significant difference between what the student got at 94, who got the A minus, and what the other student got who got an A. I mean, you can't tell him or her that you're radically different in a very important way from the 95 grade student because you only got 94. So you have to admit that this is a free choice that you've made and that you could have made in another way. But at the same time, you have to say, I had reasons for drawing the borderline here, and just hope the student does not press you too hard for what those reasons were. So Dorothy mentioned last night an example I used in that earlier lecture of the paint merchant with the tubes of paint. He wants to arrange them so that the reds are in one place and the oranges are in another. And actually there are two variants. I won't spend much time on it because Dorothy introduced it last night. But on one version of the story, the merchant might find himself with shelves of a certain length, and then would have to decide whether they could completely fill, say, the first shelf in such a way that the last tube on the shelf was something that he could regard as an adequate candidate for being the least red, so that then the first tube on the next shelf would be the reddest orange. So he might have the shelves, and then he might wonder whether they would serve his purpose. And they would have to meet that condition if they were going to serve his purpose. The condition being that he was happy to think that the last tube on the shelf marked red, followed by the first tube on the shelf marked orange, that constituted a reasonable cutoff point to distinguish the reds from the oranges. Of course, he wouldn't expect any other merchant necessarily to adopt the same cutoff point. These cutoff points are just local and not intended to extend beyond the local context. So some airlines say that you can't have heavy suitcases in the cabin with you. Well, you can't really leave it like that. I think when I first started flying, that's what was said. But nowadays, of course, a number is given, a number of kilos that you may or may not have. So from the point of view of British Airways, 20 kilos is the maximum weight. But from the point of view of American Airways, 25 kilos is, in excess of 25 kilos is what counts as heavy. So heavy is being given different precise demarcations by different airlines. So they're using their freedom, the freedom that boundarylessness provides, to make different cuts. Toothbrushes have rather come in vogue in philosophical discussions. I first heard them used actually or appealed to by Hans at a talk in Göttingen when he raised the question of why we don't give toothbrushes proper names. But anyway, that's not the point. Not the point I want to talk about now, which is rather this. As you continue to use a toothbrush, it gets more and more worn out. At a certain point, you have to say, this is it. This toothbrush is no longer serviceable. But on the day you say that, you cannot distinguish how serviceable it is from how it was the day before. You're making an arbitrary cut at some point. You have some sort of reason to do it, but the reason is pretty slim, like, well, I've got to do it sometime. But it does happen. We all deal with it. We handle this problem. If you really thought there were very serious action-affecting paradoxes of vagueness, you might find it impossible to explain how anybody could change out their toothbrush. I like the example of university admissions because it shows that when you do exercise freedom in the application of a boundaryless concept, there's no change of content. So this is very plain in the case of university admissions. So in the United States, in state universities, they often have a requirement, as UT does, to take a certain percentage of the high school graduates that year. So I think it's 7% currently at UT. And that fills up a lot of the places, significantly more than half. But then after that, the university has discretion. And that's analogous to how things are with boundaryless concepts. You have discretion in how to apply them in the borderline cases. So universities might appeal to all sorts of criteria after that. They might try to engage in trying to promote diversity. That's what UT says it's doing, and we know that that's code for something else. But they're free to use whatever criteria they think are appropriate for the section of students that's not admitted under the mandatory requirement. So this is interesting because, of course, some applications of boundaryless concepts are mandatory. It's no good having any doubts about whether the ripe tomato is red or not. It just is, and you don't have any choice about whether to call it red. So similarly, the university doesn't have any choice about whether to admit the high-scoring high school students. It does have a choice about the others. But so you've got the mandatory application and the application which is non-mandatory. But the point is that if you're admitted, you're admitted. I mean, what issues from a mandatory application is the very same content as what issues from a non-mandatory application. And that's the same with boundaryless concepts. If the paint merchant calls a certain tube red, then what he's calling it is red, the very color that ripe tomatoes are. That's the content of what he says. It doesn't have to be the same shade, of course. In America, one's expected to do a lot of charitable giving. And so you have to decide, if you want to give to some good cause, how much you're going to give. So you might think, well, it's a good cause. I think I could manage $50. But then you think, well, if I could manage $50, then surely I could manage $51. And you can get yourself into a theoretical situation. But we don't really have any serious problem. I mean, we have actually I do sometimes have a slight problem with these issues. But anyway, somehow one triumphs over the problem by making a decision. So it's a non-mandatory application of the predicate or concept, appropriate donation for this cause. Then, because Dorothy mentioned it last night, I thought I'd just mention the mañana paradox that she spoke of. So the relevant concept is, could as well be done tomorrow. And so you think, well, that could as well be done tomorrow. Good. So today I'm free. And the next day comes and you think, well, that could as well be done tomorrow. You think again, but of course it's the next day. Now, I think what's interesting about the mañana paradox is that I think I haven't done any experimental philosophy on this, but I think if you ask people what's going on, they'd say, oh, it's just a manifestation of weakness of will. And I think actually that's right. Because you need to make a decision. And that's because needs to be done now is a boundaryless concept. And so it doesn't fix its application in the way that classical concepts do. So you have to decide. That's an exercise of the will. Now, I've mentioned a lot about the freedom that boundarylessness provides. And so here's meant to be an argument for that. So in many cases, admittedly not all, you're required to make a clean cut somewhere. We've seen lots of examples that I gave with the last slide. First premise. Second premise, there's no way you were required to make it. That seems intuitively clearly true. But those two premises just entail that there must be more than one acceptable way to make it. And that's the freedom that I'm urging that you should regard as a distinctive characteristic of boundaryless concepts. And that's the notion that we'll in the end do some explanatory work when it comes to the paradoxes of vagueness. So I'm only going to talk about two so-called paradoxes of vagueness. Maybe there are more, I don't know. But anyway, I'm only going to do two today. One is the forced march paradoxes, and the other are the Sorites paradoxes. And my conclusion is going to be that forced march paradoxes are not paradoxes of vagueness. And therefore, it would be, if anything, confusing or misleading to appeal to vagueness in any exclusive capacity when discussing forced march paradoxes. Sorites paradoxes, on the other hand, really are paradoxes of vagueness, and so they do need to be addressed, and I will address them. Strangely enough, the distinction between forced march paradoxes and Sorites paradoxes has only recently become at all common in the literature. So I noticed, for example, that Stephen Schiffer's discussion of vagueness almost always gives you forced march paradoxes to reflect on, as if these were the problem for vagueness. But I'm going to suggest that they're not a problem for vagueness. And here's Crispin Wright, who is sort of really trying to describe two paradoxes at once, which is, I think, rather confusing. So I'll read the whole thing, first of all. If a color patch is justifiably described as red, a pairwise indiscriminable or even just noticeable change in shade must leave it justifiably described as red. So if you've got this stuff about justifiably described, you've got something epistemic, something to do with justification. If you leave out the green material, then you've got something metaphysical, something that doesn't mention justification. And that's, for me, a crucial difference. Admittedly, of course, for Crispin, he might not have accepted this perspective in which metaphysics and epistemology are so radically distinct because of his enthusiasm for intuitionistic logic. But even so, I found it a bit puzzling. One of the things that people often do in this kind of context is to quote Crispin's early, 1975, statement of a tolerance principle. And a lot of people read that as a metaphysical claim, as the claim that things that are very similar are the same, not merely similar. But what his actual words are, that very small differences cannot affect the justice with which the predicate is applied. So, it started off as as an epistemic notion, although it's often, as I say, quoted metaphysically, even by Crispin himself, incidentally, in subsequent work. And here he's got both at once. But I'm insisting on the distinction between the epistemological and the metaphysical. So this is sort of image you might be shown, in which you could be asked to do a forced march on. So people say, look at the left-hand thing. What's that? Oh, well, that's red. Okay, now put the most left-hand one and the next right-hand one together. What do you think then? So you would be shown a pair, say, like that pair. Looks very orangey on this screen. It's quite red on my computer, I can promise. And so the idea is that you're given these pairwise comparisons, and the left-hand element is something which you've already judged to satisfy a certain predicate, say the predicate red. You've already judged that to be red, and you know you've judged it to be red, the way things are normally set up in forced march cases. So you know you've just judged the left-hand one to be red. And there's not much of a difference, or maybe even no difference that you can detect between what the left-hand one looks like and what the right-hand one looks like. So you feel compelled to judge that the right-hand one is red as well. So there's an inference going on here, and it's something like this. I've just called called patch n red. Patch n plus 1 looks almost or even completely similar. So I should call n plus 1 red too. So here's an epistemic principle at work. It's got nothing to do with vagueness, or at any rate, it's completely detachable from vagueness. And it's obviously incorrect principle. I mean, no one in their right minds, once it's pointed out, would dream of accepting this. If you tried to state the principle in a general way, it would be this ep equals business. If you can discern no significant difference between x and y, and you have judged x to be thus and so, then you should judge y to be thus and so also. But obviously there are going to be tons of examples to this where we may well be making this judgment as we normally are in color cases without the extremely fine discrimination that we'd need to justify that principle, and that's just a defective principle. Actually, there's something interesting here, but also a little puzzling, that Diana Raffman, in her book Unruly Words, makes a similar point about, she says, experimental, because she did experiments about forced marches, and she says experimental subjects dislike being inconsistent. I think she actually used, I think I've quoted her correctly, not merely being thought inconsistent, but being inconsistent. And she produces a principle somewhat like that and says perhaps that's what's at issue. But it's a little bit odd that she should do this because the book is focused entirely on forced marches, whereas the natural conclusion from these considerations, in my opinion, is that forced marches are nothing to do with vagueness, really. They're to do with this defective epistemic principle. So let me use an example to try and convince you of that. So here's a vagueness-free forced march paradox. So at the beginning of the story, a cake is placed in your left hand and you're told it weighs 450 grams. And you have every reason to believe that your informant is knowledgeable, trustworthy, blah, blah, whatever you want. So you rightly believe that the cake in your left hand weighs 450 grams. Then a cake is placed in your right hand. The cake actually weighs 449 grams. Then the cake in your left hand is removed, and the cake that was in your right hand is placed in your left hand, and another cake is placed in your right hand. No guesses as to what the cake then put in your right hand weighs. It's 448 grams. And so you could go on in this forced march. We don't have any vagueness here. What we have is an inadequate measuring instrument, namely your hands. There's nothing, vagueness is not in the story, but we have the elements of a forced march. So my thought is that we should not regard forced marches as characteristic of vagueness. Now, of course, it's true that vagueness is one way in which you can set up a forced march situation, but it's not the only way. And so if you want to go to the essence of forced marches, you don't look at a special case, namely forced marches induced by vagueness. You look at the notion of what's going on in a forced march in general, something that will cover all the cases. That would be the explanation you would look for. So we've seen that not all forced marches can be explained by an account of vagueness, but it seems right to say that all require essentially the same explanation. We've got a unified phenomenon here, and then that entails that the explanation shouldn't appeal to vagueness, because in all these cases you're forced to make judgments concerning things that differ either undetectably or in ways that seem insufficient to justify a judgment of difference. And that's the unifying feature of forced marches. But that can happen whether or not the phenomenon is produced by vagueness, even if it's produced in a sharp way, as it was with the cake. Conclusion: forced march paradoxes are not paradoxes of vagueness. Hence, an adequate account of vagueness has no necessity to say anything about forced marches. I have to say that's not going to be a super popular conclusion. Okay, but now we turn to Sorites paradoxes. So I think they're best presented in a formal way, which they often are, and as the apparent soundness of arguments with a false conclusion. Of course, an argument which is sound cannot have a false conclusion, so we know something's gone wrong. So let's set it out in the standard kind of way. So we take some predicate, say F is red or something, and we stipulate that there's a series containing a number of elements, and we use the prime operator to indicate the immediate successor of that on which it operates. So for all x, fx arrow fx prime means every x, which is f, has something f as its immediate successor. And then fn, you take some suitably large number and say, let's say, the idea is that fn says something like this last element in our series, which is in fact manifestly not red but orange, is red. So the argument is, I think, apparently sound, but it has a false conclusion, and that's impossible. So it's only the first and the third premises have truth values that are set by the stipulation of the example. So we can't really discuss that. Now, people have, in the history of discussions of vagueness, wondered whether there might be some, the various sort of fancy logics or whatever might come into this story. But I'm going to offer an account which keeps firmly within the classical framework and does not endeavor to solve this by any adjustment in the logic. So I'm going to say that that says just what you would think it says if you're a classical logician, just that everything F has an F thing as its immediate successor in the series. And then one thing we know straight away is that this is false. So the problem of, because the argument can't be sound, but it is valid, because we're not moving outside the classical framework, so one of the premises has to be false, but it can't be premise 1 because that's true by stipulation, so it's premise 2 that has to be false. So this means that we're going to have to challenge, at a minimum, we have to refuse to accept, or perhaps deny, 2, what I'm going to refer to 2 as the Sorites premise, or SP. And classically, that requires us to accept what Wright has called the unpalatable existential, which says that some object in the series, which is F, has something which is not F as its immediate successor. So I'll go on with Wright. I rather like Wright's phrase for this, the unpalatable existential. So I'll go on calling this UE. So what is it to respond to a paradox, or to this paradox in particular? Well, we know the truth value of the problematic premise. We know the truth value of the Sorites premise, namely false, assuming we're keeping to the most ordinary sort of semantic framework in which bivalence obtains. So we know that the Sorites premise cannot be true, else there are no tall people. There couldn't be tall people if the Sorites premise is true, because we know that that if someone's 5'6", they're not tall, and if they're 5'6" plus a millimeter, they're not tall, and so on, so nobody's tall. Okay, bad conclusion. What's the right thing to say? The Sorites premise is false. So then what is the problem? So what's the problem? Oh, of course, the unpalatable existential must be true for the same reason. There needs to be an adjacent couple, one of which has the property F, and the adjacent one doesn't. So that has to be true. There's nothing else to think but that SP is false and UE is true. So the problem is not the truth values, it's the problem of our disinclination. It's a psychological problem. It's the problem of our disinclination to accept what's on the screen. What's on the screen seems to be indisputable. But of course it's hard to believe in a way, or it's hard to digest. So that's what needs to be addressed. So we've got to explain why the false Sorites premise seems true, and the true unpalatable existential seems false. Well, I think there are three things one might bring to bear. So in a case like this, there may be more than one explanation. We're dealing with psychology, with human psychology, trying to understand why people react so badly to the idea that the SP is false and that the UE is true. So one can appeal to more than one explanation. So I'm going to mention three. And I think it's the third that is the deepest and most interesting one. But the first two are not completely without interest. So one thing is that the Sorites premise is typically presented in a completely decontextualized context. So this is a context in which we have no clue about how we might exercise the freedom that boundaryless concepts give us. We don't have any clue about how to do that or where to make a cut unless you get some context into the story. Now, I think this is very conspicuous in what I regard as the most elegant of the Sorites paradoxes, which is Wang's paradox. So 1 is a small number. Any number bigger by just 1 than a small number is also small. So it's very beautiful. You know that what I've just said can't be true. But no, it's hard to say why it shouldn't be true. But if you add a bit of context, things go a lot better. So let's have a small number of people for dinner. How many were you thinking of? 10? I don't call that a small number. Okay. So even for numbers, there are situations in which you can rightfully make a cut. And so you can accept that Wang's paradox is not really a paradox because it's not true in every context and under every circumstance. But something bigger by 1 than a small number is also small. So another possible explanation is that we confuse the question whether the Sorites premise is true with the question how we would do on a forced march. No doubt badly. But of course that's not the issue. We know that forced marches have nothing to do with our topic. So the fact that we would do badly on a forced march, which I'm sure is true for most of us, well, we know it's really true of the population at large because Diana Raffman did the experiments and showed that this was the case, that people did badly on forced marches. So if somehow you confused forced marches with Sorites paradoxes, you could see how you might be perplexed by the falsehood of the Sorites premise and the truth of the unpalatable existential. But I think there's a deeper explanation for our discomfort, and that is that we don't make a distinction between truth and settled truth. So I'm introducing settled truth as a technical term. So I'll explain how I got there. I hope MM will be pleased that I'm about to mention something that Aristotle said. I agree it's not Plato, but I was doing my best. So a truth is settled at a time if and only if its truth maker exists or has existed at that time. You'll actually find not exactly those words, but something very similar in De Interpretatione, except that instead of settled truth, Aristotle says necessary. But I think settled is necessary is got too many. Nowadays, it means something else. So what Aristotle showed in that chapter was that fatalists and anti-fatalists need this distinction, the distinction between truth and settled truth, in order to express their difference. That's how I understand what's going on there. So fatalists hold that truths about the future are already settled. So, but anti-fatalists deny that. So anti-fatalists say, no, okay, no, I agree, it may be true that there'll be a sea battle tomorrow, but it's not a settled truth. So the conclusion that Aristotle was worried that the fatalists would make, namely that there's nothing we can do about it and nothing we do makes any difference, wouldn't follow. The truth maker for there will be a sea battle tomorrow for anti-fatalists does not exist now. Now, the notion of settled truth, and this is where some convergence begins between the structure of my approach and the structure of Dorothy's, is that a disjunction may be settled even if neither disjunct is. So the fatalist will claim that it's entirely coherent to hold that although it's settled that either there will be a sea battle tomorrow or there will not be a sea battle tomorrow, it's not settled that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or, it's not settled that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, and also not settled that there will not be a sea battle tomorrow. So, familiar point. But what we can do is to apply this notion of settled truth, which already has a role carved out for it in the fatalist discussion. We can apply it to the notion of decision, and then, of course, given that boundaryless concepts are bound up with the notion of decision, we can apply it to vagueness. So that's my plan in the next couple of slides. So it's a settled truth, let's suppose, that you will choose either the pistachio or the chocolate when you reach the ice cream counter. How is that settled? You've never chosen anything except chocolate or pistachio. You are just a chocolate stroke pistachio free. But on this particular occasion, you have not made up your mind. You have not decided which you're going to choose. So the disjunction is settled. But because you haven't decided, it's not settled that you will choose the pistachio and not settled that you will choose the chocolate. As we say, you are in two minds at that point. So we have an operator that does not distribute over disjunction. So let's apply that to the unpalatable existential, or rather, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but I'm going to apply it to a close cousin of the unpalatable existential, a disjunction that begins, the first element of the series is F and the second element is not, or the second element is F, but the third element is not, or, and so on through the long disjunction. I'm feeling this is exactly what Dorothy did last night. I hope that's right. I mean, structurally, we're appealing to slightly different contents. So if you confront that disjunction, which I'm just going to treat as equivalent to the unpalatable existential, which it is for finite cases, someone confronting that might agree that the disjunction was settled without agreeing that any disjunct was. So the disjunction is settled. It has to be. That's what we discovered at an early stage. We discovered that the unpalatable existential had to be true. It's sort of embarrassing and awkward, but there's nothing else to be said other than that it's true. But now, supposing we're then equipped with the distinction between truth and settled truth, we can elaborate. What I mean is that the unpalatable existential is a settled truth. But, of course, I don't think that entails that any of the disjuncts is settled. I haven't done my deciding yet. I haven't chosen the pistachio, and I haven't chosen the chocolate. So But under good conditions, of course, this can be resolved, if there's any reason to. I mean, very often there will be no reason to do it, but it can be done. That's an exercise of the freedom that boundarylessness gives. So I just want to conclude by saying how boundarylessness contributes to the explanation here. So boundarylessness engenders freedom. The exercise of freedom involves decision and action, making room for the distinction between truth and settled truth. The Sorites premise is a settled falsehood without settled counterexamples. The unpalatable existential is a settled truth without settled witnesses. So that's the story, and I hope you now feel a whole lot better.